Hey, good afternoon, everybody. It's PennLive Opinion Editor John Misick. It's Friday afternoon, it's nice out, and we're inside anyway. We're going to have our final interview today with the Pennsylvania Republican gubernatorial candidates. You've heard from Laura Ellsworth, you've heard from Scott Wagner. Today we're going to hear from Pittsburgh businessman Paul Mango. So here we go. Paul, thanks for coming in. Appreciate it.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. We do this one of two ways. Candidate's pleasure. You can offer an opening statement if you'd like, or we can just dive straight into questions, whatever you prefer.
Yeah, maybe just 1 or 2 minutes if that's okay. Sure. I think I've been telling folks, if you were born in Pennsylvania any time in the last 35 or 40 years and you grew up here, there's only a few things you know. That factories close, that businesses leave, that jobs leave, that population leaves, that we're losing congressmen, that we're ranked either 42nd, 43rd, or 39th in just about everything. And so I believe this campaign is really about the leadership necessary to take Pennsylvania in a new direction. And I believe what leaders do extremely well is offer hope and optimism about the future to the people they're leading. And that's why we came out a long, long time ago with our vision for the future of Pennsylvania called Restore the Dream. And by the way, that's not my vision for the future of Pennsylvania. It's the result of input from thousands of Pennsylvanians during hundreds of meetings. And the good news about Pennsylvania is that we have everything within our grasp to be a wonderfully prosperous, successful, shaping, leading Commonwealth. We need someone with a different agenda, someone who's actually going to lead Pennsylvanians, and that's the role I intend to play starting in January 2019.
Okay, well, I'm going to jump into an education question. And your latest, I think it might be the latest ad, you talk about giving schools the resources that they need to keep schools secure. What about the resources they need to educate students?
Yeah. So I agree with our president when I say this is the civil rights issue of our day. I believe that every 18-year-old is entitled to having the skills necessary to be competitive in a globally relevant economy. I believe every 18-year-old should be prepared to be good citizens. I don't really care what that costs. What I know today is we're spending $18,000 per pupil per year, and we're not getting either of those two in large numbers. I come from Pittsburgh. If you look at Pittsburgh City schools, public school district, we spend literally almost $400,000 per graduate. And if you look at the standardized test scores, which I'm not necessarily a big fan of, but they do reveal that about 25% of them can't read and another large percentage cannot do anything more than 8th grade math. They are not prepared for meaningful work in a globally competitive economy. So I'm happy to make big investments in education if we can meet those two standards. But I'm not going to throw a bunch of money into a system that is failing us. The governor has increased education funding by 15% just in the last couple of years. No discernible movement whatsoever in performance. So let's invest in the right things. And what are those right things? First of all, I think we need a lot of innovation in the way we teach our kids. I have 5 daughters. I've been in many parent-teacher conferences. What I notice is what I saw 45 years ago. 25 desks, a blackboard, a teacher, a classroom. I don't think today we should be teaching every child in every subject exactly the same way. That's not the way they learn. They learn very differently, and I think we ought to begin to innovate and adapt and let our teachers bring their great ideas. I've spoken to scores of teachers, and they have great ideas about how to teach our kids to read better, how to teach them math better, but they feel constrained by mandates. They feel constrained by some standardized tests that don't have relevance to the equation of meaningful skills in the globally competitive economy. So I would be eager, Jan, I would be eager to invest more in education if we could prove to ourselves that that's going to lead to positive outcomes for our children. I don't think we're there yet.
And just follow up then, there is this school funding case that is making its way through the court system.
Okay.
And the folks that brought that case, I mean, they're seeking, they say that we just don't have adequate resources in all our schools to help the kids reach standards, and people that have put a price tag on it say this could cost $3 to $4 billion more. Would you be, if the courts ruled that we had to invest $3 to $4 billion more into public education, would you be willing to comply with that court order?
As governor, I think I'd have to. That wouldn't be my preference if it didn't meet the standards I talked about. But, you know, we took, a year ago, we took all 500 school districts, give or take one or two, and we plotted them, a very simple graph. What are we spending per pupil per year, and what is the performance? What are the outcomes of that according to standardized test scores? There was zero correlation whatsoever, zero correlation. And I'm talking about a range of maybe $12,000 at the low end up to $40,000 a year for some of these schools. There was no correlation. So I just don't think that more resources without fixing the underlying issues is going to solve this issue. We've been putting more resources in education for decades, and we haven't changed the outcomes in a meaningful way. So again, I'm a big proponent of education. I'm a product of the public schools. My 5 daughters are products of the public schools. I want them to work, but I don't think it's a prudent use of Pennsylvania taxpayers' money to throw more into education before we figure out what's going to work. I hope I'm not faced with the decision of asking taxpayers for $4 billion more against the same system. I really hope I don't have to face that.
This week, your Republican competitor, Mr. Wagner, began airing an advertisement featuring his daughter, Catherine, specifically addressing some of the charges he brought up in an advertisement the other week about his record at Penn Waste, some matters relating to an earlier divorce. If Mr. Wagner aired a similar ad against you, how would you go home and explain that to your daughter? How do you think that would impact your own children if he aired a similar, with a similar line, very personal attack against you? And why would that be justified?
Yeah, well, we've said this from the beginning. What happened between the senator and his daughter is an issue between him, his daughter, and the law. We don't think it's appropriate to bring families into this, and we're not going to comment on his daughter.
That's not what I asked. So,
yeah.
If he aired a similar line of attack against you, calling you a deadbeat dad, would you think that was right, and how would you go home and explain that to your children?
They'd be alarmed because I didn't miss an $800,000 payment with, I've only been married once, John. I've been married to the same woman for 36 years. I've never made an alimony payment. I've never been in a divorce proceeding. I've never missed an alimony or child support, whatever they call it, arrearage. I'm not familiar with all the terms because I've never been in divorce court, but I think they'd be alarmed because it would be false.
Do you regret airing that ad now, given the amount of heat that it's caused you, given the sort of the outrage it's caused within the party?
The ad that he ran against us?
Oh. You ran against him?
Oh, absolutely not. Oh, listen, let's go back just a little bit. On July 30th, this guy was interviewed, I think, by you all, if I'm not mistaken, or someone, maybe at PennLive. And he said West Point is nothing more than a free education. That's not just an insult to me, or my wife, who's a West Point graduate, or my daughter, who's a West Point graduate. That's an insult to every Service Academy graduate, every ROTC graduate, every soldier who comes back and uses the GI Bill. He insulted hundreds of thousands of Pennsylvanians and their families. Subsequent to that, he stood up on stage and called me a liar on television, okay, when we were discussing the Pennsylvania Fairness Act. And guess what? Constitutional lawyers, in-state lawyers, the Pennsylvania Family Institute, the Catholic Conference, the Diocese of Philadelphia all said, Senator Wagner's wrong, Paul Mango is right. He didn't apologize for that. And then he ran an attack ad against me that was 100% false. I'm sure you're going to want to talk about that. And what we did on March 21st, shortly after he put that up, we posted a video. We posted it twice. We said, these are lies. We need you to take this down. We're going to give you that opportunity. As a gentleman, I'm going to give you that opportunity. If you don't, you can go back and look on our Facebook page. If you don't, we're going to reveal to the people of Pennsylvania the character of a liar. Because you can't contest these lies. What you have to do is reveal the character of the liar. We gave him an opportunity to do it. He didn't do it. We have absolutely zero regrets. The response to that has been phenomenal.
And I'm sorry, for the good of the record, the ad you're alluding to, that's the one where you talk about you receiving contract, you being supportive of Obamacare. Is that the one we're
Yes.
discussing here? Okay, just wanted to check. The end of that last spot hints at violent for Scott Wagner. It appears to be his confrontation with the Democratic tracker at New York Country Club last August.
Yes.
Do you plan to go ahead to release that ad?
We're gonna. We have a lot of material. We have a lot of ads. That is one of them. And we intend to continue to define the character of this person. And here's why. We think character matters. He may not. We think character matters. No one knows a year from now, 2 years from now, 4 years from now, 6 years from now, what the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is going to face. What voters should understand is how any leader would respond to an uncertain situation. And we think it's important for the people of Pennsylvania to know that he has responded violently in many situations in his past, and how that differs from what my past is about. So, absolutely. Why wouldn't we want to do something like that?
You're the other candidate in this race, Ms. Ellsworth, in an op-ed the other day, said that the two of you have sullied our elections, and that the two of you are, quote, engaged in a race to the bottom. Are you concerned about the tone this will set for our politics? We live in a pretty coarse era for politics as it is, I think you would agree. Are you worried about turning off voters, potentially keeping people away from the polls just because they're just sort of sick of the negativity?
Well, first of all, it's a rough and tumble game, okay? And we understand that. It's a contact sport. I've been involved in, even though not elected office, I've been involved in a number of political situations during my time in corporate America. But the strange thing about your question, John, is when we were running very positive issue-based ads, we never got any attention from anyone. We're getting a heck of a lot of attention from the media now. So I'm not sure exactly who likes them and who dislikes them, but I have to say this. The amount of positive response we've gotten from our base, and Paul, it's about time you fought back. We know you gave this bully an opportunity to take this thing down, and he didn't. Keep on fighting, because we want a fighter. We want someone who's going to fight for the people of Pennsylvania. Now, as far as Ms. Ellsworth's concerned, she didn't support Donald Trump. She didn't vote for Donald Trump. She gave money to Barack Obama 3 times. She gave money to Hillary Clinton. She gave money to Bob Casey. She gave money to Jay Costa. And I said this before, unashamedly. She should be running in the Democratic primary against Tom Wolf.
I had a question. I'm a disabled veteran from something that happened 25 years ago in the Army.
Thank you for your service, Vincent.
Thank you, sir. And I've been frustrated for the last 5, starting with $90 a week in physical therapy for an Army injury, and having my neck fused with a plate, and paying for that operation with my private insurance. Now it's time for me to work with the VA to get them to give me the service that's required. Now what has happened is they have stonewalled me and not given me the service once I became 50%, and they're supposed to increase what they do for me. So if we back that up a little bit, imagine me being a college graduate in cybersecurity and a 9th grader, combat veteran with no legs, no family, no love of God, and an addiction to painkillers, trying to go up against the VA when they frustrate me. And 21 veterans committing, at least 20 veterans committing suicide in the nation, and PA having an inordinate proportion of those veterans. I'm curious, as governor, what would you do to allow that individual with a high school diploma the ability to navigate the VA with respect, with results, and with transparency?
So first of all, I think the Veterans Administration is an example of what I call a relic of the early 20th century bureaucracy, a highly standardized, centralized, bureaucratic organization. I think its intentions are pure. I think the execution is terrible. Okay, the execution is terrible. There's a lot of empirical evidence for that. We've already had discussions with folks at the Veterans Administration about the opportunity to pilot in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania more VA choice. And I think, Vincent, you may be familiar with the VA choice program, which is how do you permit veterans to use more private services? We haven't gone nearly far enough. Okay, we haven't gone nearly far enough. It's still too bureaucratic. But what do we have here in Pennsylvania? some of the most advanced clinical healthcare providers in the world, okay? Not in the United States, in the world. When you think about UPMC and Geisinger and UPenn, and there's just a tremendous number of systems. We could save the wait time and the access issue. We could eliminate that overnight if we just expanded the VA choice. We want to be the pilot state to be able to do that. We've begun those conversations. We're not going to wait till January 2019. But we're also, and you'll see it in our plan, very intent on helping the veterans make the transition back into civilian society as they leave the service, and particularly as they leave combat zones. We think it's vital, and the statistics would suggest, on your point about suicide, if you don't get to them in the first 90 to 180 days, they often go down a path that's hard to bring them back. It's very hard to bring them back. So we want veterans, as yourself, like me, like others, to help mentor these younger folks when they come out of the service. We think that's very important. We want to get them into the workforce as quickly as possible if they're healthy and they're able, not those who need medical care. If they're healthy and able, we want to make sure we waive any licensing requirements. If you're a nurse, if you're a helicopter mechanic, if you're a truck driver, why should you have to relicense in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania? It's very expensive and it takes a long time. And lastly, we want to make sure, as you know, and I'm associated with many of them, there are thousands of veteran services organizations in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania who want to help our dear veterans. They don't know how to get to them. And by the way, the veterans don't always know how to get to the VSOs. So we have committed to creating an electronic marketplace where a veteran can say, I need help with any issue. It could be a children's education. It could be retrofitting my home because I've lost a limb. It could be employment. It could be a number of things. And we want to make sure we get the right VSO linked up with the right veteran and create a marketplace where they can both thrive. But to your point about, just to close off on this, on medical services, we think this is much more appropriately delivered by some of our great providers here. There's an organization in Pennsylvania called Warrior Centric Care that is training hospitals. We've had conversations with training hospitals on the particular issues that face veterans so that when a veteran comes to a civilian hospital, those care providers understand the context, but they also have the clinical capability to take care of that veteran. So we want to advance that as rapidly as we can.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Question.
Anwar.
Good evening. Thank you for coming, and I'm fortunate to meet you, Mr. Mangan.
Yeah.
As an educator,
yeah.
I had an opportunity today to ask my 4th grade class what they would like, with them being our future, what kind of questions they would want to ask you.
Oh, that's great.
And one of the questions was, with so many public schools closing and with charter schools, coming and going, if you even advocate for the charter school system, what kind of examples do you have or can you give to keep our school systems, and it kind of goes ties in with what Jan was stating, to keep our school systems open, like our public schools in particular?
Yeah. So first of all, I am a big proponent of school choice. And as you probably know, there are tens of thousands of children and their families on waiting lists to get into alternative institutions. I spent a lot of time in inner city Philadelphia and Pittsburgh talking to students, talking to teachers, talking to administrators. And the number one thing that I'm hearing students say to me when they have chosen an alternative to the core public school, I know our charters are part of the public school system. The number one answer they give me when I say, why did you leave the public school system? It's because I did not feel safe. Okay, I did not feel safe. So our public school system in many of our areas are not providing the basic foundation for learning, which is underlying security for these kids. Many of our school districts, our public school districts, I have found, refuse to enforce the types of standards for safety. In fact, I read something a couple months ago about unless there's the potential for serious bodily harm, we're not going to remove a child from that environment. Well, I wouldn't want to send my child to a school, any one of my 5 daughters to a school, that says we're not going to do anything unless there's the threat of serious bodily harm to your child. So I'm hoping that the public school system can adapt to the needs of parents and kids in the 21st century here. But until that happens, I feel we absolutely have to offer these parents and kids alternatives. And if that's the choice the market is going to make, I think we have to support that. I want nothing more than our public school systems to thrive. But how many generations are we going to permit to go by where kids are not learning, where they don't feel safe, where they're not prepared for meaningful work, and they're not good citizens? How many generations are we going to let go by? I don't think we can sustain it much longer.
We have a related question there from
Yeah.
a reader, in fact, and himself also an educator,
Yeah.
who wants to know what you think is a practical way to make schools safer that in effect does not turn them into armed camps or
Yes.
that involves locking them down.
Thank you, John, and thank your reader for the question. I've said this, and this is part of my, if you will, governing philosophy. I do not think a one-size-fits-all solution from Harrisburg ever works. I would never force a school district to have an armed guard at every door, as my opponent has. I just wouldn't do that. Here's what I would do. Of our 500 school districts, I would ask every one of them to assess the comprehensive set of threats facing the children in that school. And I've quoted some statistics. I'm not sure I'm just giving you rough numbers, but when you look at the number of school shootings that have resulted in deaths since 1990, it's been about 400. Okay, we're talking almost 30 years. Last year, our children in middle and high school collectively committed 4,000 suicides in 1 year. Okay, so let's put that into the equation. How about drug overdoses of our high school kids? Let's put that into the equation. If we're really concerned about the safety and security of our children, let's comprehensively assess the threats in that school environment. There's a lot of bullying going on. You probably see that, Anwar. There's a lot of cyberbullying going on. There's a lot of isolation. There's a lack of mentorship. And this leads to kids going down a wrong path, and some of them to commit suicide. So I'm trying to answer your question here, John, or of your viewer. I would require every school district to assess comprehensively the threats that it faces. Hopefully that's based in fact. I mean, we can get 10 or 20 years from each of these school districts as to what's happened, and then develop a plan that meets those threats in that school district. I can tell you, if you go to downtown Philly, there are already metal detectors and armed guards. Okay, they're already there. Why would we force anything else? But some rural school districts have open campuses. They have a different set of threats. And make sure they come back to us with a plan that addresses those specific, customized threats. So we would require those standards. And as I've often said, it's not about standardization, it is about standards. So we don't tell people how to get it done. We tell them there's a standard that they have to meet.
Does that include arming teachers?
Here's what I would say. I would never force it, but would I permit it? Yes. So if a local school district decides, along with its board, the parents, the kids, the teachers, that is the best way to defend and prioritize the threats they face, sure, we should let them do that with the appropriate training, but we're never going to force it. I'm never going to force it. Let's put it that way.
Can I piggyback off of that?
Sure.
Real quick? How would you, excuse me for taking a second or two.
No, please.
How would you prepare for the trauma for a school teacher that may have to use a weapon to protect their students or themselves in a school environment?
Yeah. Well, you mean if God forbid, they had to use the weapon in a way to protect their kids?
Yes.
You know, I've spoken to school teachers. Some of them don't feel that they could ever do that. And we should not require them to have, in any way, carry a weapon. I think others feel a little bit defenseless themselves, at least in talking to them. I think the person has to feel, we don't want anyone to do anything that is uncomfortable for them. But I think there is a spectrum of folks who have different opinions. I'm talking about teachers, who some would obviously want to carry those weapons. They want to be trained, obviously. I think we want to train them, give them the resources to train them, but not force anyone who doesn't feel comfortable doing it. I'm worried about the teachers being overly traumatized by some of the things that have happened in the schools, and I think many of them wish they could have the means to offer defense for their children. I certainly, as a parent, again, of five children, I would be, if our school district said that's what they wanted to do, I would be very much in favor of that.
Let's throw one back to you.
Okay.
Well, this week we heard John Boehner shift his position on marijuana,
John
saying-
Boehner did?
Yes.
The former speaker?
Yes.
Okay.
Saying that it shouldn't be classified as a Schedule I drug, and I'm
Yeah.
just wondering, if you could
Yeah.
share your view on the
Yes.
legalization of adult use or recreational marijuana.
Yeah. So I always divide it into two, Jan, as you know. I first talk about medical marijuana, and I've spoken to about 20 physicians about the use of medical marijuana, and they all said precisely the same thing, which is there are indications of use that are beneficial to patients, and we support it. So I am supportive of the use of medical marijuana. Now I know as a Class 1A drug that provides some complications and how we pay for it, whether you can use credit cards, how it's dispensed, how it's used, so it's actually creating some barriers. Let's just go to the other side for a second. I'm completely against the use of and approval of recreational marijuana. You say, well, why is that? Well, we are in the midst of the worst public health crisis in the history of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which is a drug overdose epidemic. I think we need to put all of the possible resources, leadership time, focus, and attention we can into addressing that issue, and I think it would be completely incoherent to say we're going to make it easier for kids or young adults to get their hands on a gateway drug that might lead to more of these overdoses. So I think where we have to find some common ground is if we're going to approve the use of medical marijuana, just as we have done with other pharmaceuticals and much more powerful drugs than marijuana, we need to give our medical community, our doctors, our nurses, the leeway to prescribe and use that according to indications in a way that does not compromise their personal integrity or their lawfulness. So I do think we have to address that.
And I think one of the questions that's before the health secretary right now is whether to allow the dry leaf form of medical marijuana, because it would cost less and it's easier to get to the dispensaries.
I don't have a specific perspective, but here's what I always do, Jan. I always turn to the professionals in the medical community for that advice. I've been doing that for 25 years as a healthcare executive, and I think our physicians are some of the best in the world, and they are in good faith offering the best advice they can. So I would turn to them to help make that decision. I'm not skirting the question. I just think that is for a clinical expert to comment on, not a healthcare executive.
Okay. You did talk about the environment of private organizations and the generosity of many Americans to help veterans.
Yeah.
What I'm thinking about is we spend a lot of money on the VA, and I expect the VA, from the money that we give them, to completely take care of the job. I would like private institutions to be the icing on the cake, to be the love on that cake.
Yeah.
Okay. The VA is not meeting a need, so I want that money taken care of. I'd like Americans to choose to help in their specific communities to help them with jobs and things like that. But then again, the VA should be doing that with maybe a public-private partnership. Mm-hmm. But how can you, as a governor, put pressure on the political will and pressure on Washington to make them do what they need to do for Pennsylvanians?
Yeah. So, Vincent, my understanding is there are some public-private partnerships with the American Legion, with the VFW, with VSOs, and the VA. So there's a lot of interaction between and among those already, and there's some funding and grants and so forth that come to those organizations. But I just, here's what the VA has a mission impossible, I think, right now, which is to be all things to all veterans and all geographies as it relates to health care and so forth. I just think, my personal opinion, and I love our veterans, and I put a lot of my personal time and my charitable donations into our veterans, but the VA's reach far exceeds its grasp right now, far exceeds its grasp. And I think what we should do is make sure that they do what they can do best, and they do some extraordinary things. They take care of traumatic brain injury like no one else, a traumatic amputation, Agent Orange, things that are highly specific to a combat or a military environment. And I think we ought to invest in the VA to be the best in the world in those areas. But when it comes to the common cold, when it comes to diabetes and other things that are not military or combat related, I think we ought to get, when you say public-private partnership, I think we ought to get our private providers more deeply involved, because I just think it's too difficult, again, to be all things to all people in all geographies. Very, very tough mission, and I think we just need to modernize it. So I don't want to disagree with you. I'm just saying I've seen these organizations from the inside. I know a bit about them. I think it is very difficult to ask them to be more nimble, to be more adaptive when they're being controlled by a bureaucracy in Washington that is unrelenting. That is unrelenting.
Just the last
Yeah.
thing, real quick.
Yeah.
Think of a soldier who graduated high school with an effective
Yeah.
8th grade education.
Right.
The Army teaches on an 8th grade education. These soldiers need to understand
Yeah.
how to easily,
Yeah.
and they need to be helped.
Yeah, and we're supposed to, and I visited many of these sites. We have VA directors in every one of our counties in Pennsylvania. I don't know if you knew that, but I've been to these offices. That's the role of these folks, is to try to get help soldiers and facilitate them getting access to their VA benefits. And maybe we don't have the right training and the right skills in those individuals, but I think the attempt is there as a liaisons to the Veterans Administration to help local soldiers. So anyway, we can take a close look at that, but I think the attempt is there, and maybe it's not working.
Paul, just want to clarify a quick
Yeah.
biographical point. In your ads on your
Yeah.
website, in your speeches, you've
Yeah.
mentioned a couple of times that you completed Ranger training.
Yes.
Were you also certified?
Yeah, I have my Ranger tab, yes.
Okay.
Let me explain the difference. I actually, in 1979, when I was a cadet at West Point, we had about 1,000 classmates. 40 of them were chosen to go to Ranger School. Okay. So I went. It's a 9-week course in 3 different locations in Georgia, Florida. When people say you're up to your neck in alligators, it was actually true for me, by the way. So I completed that 9-week course and got what people call as a Ranger tab. What I didn't do after graduation was go to a Ranger battalion, which is a special unit within the military. I went to the 82nd Airborne Division instead. So that's the distinction. That's why we say Ranger trained,
Right.
not a U.S. Army Ranger in the sense that I was part of a Ranger battalion. Those guys are very special people, and I would never claim that in my biographical
I
background.
thought not, but
Yeah.
felt like one clarified. You did when you were talking to Vincent earlier. You
Yeah.
mentioned reentry for veterans. One
Yes.
of the areas where you have clashed with Mr. Wagner is over this clean slate
Yeah.
bill, which would actually smooth the path for ex-convicts who are seeking to reenter society to become productive again and presumably not go back to prison. You mischaracterized his stance on that bill. Do you support it in whole or in part, and if not, why not?
Okay. Well, the part that I disagree with him on, and you can look this up, in the Pottsville Mercury in 2016, I believe, he wrote an editorial. He authored it. And he said, I would like to extend the clean slate bill to nonviolent felons. Nonviolent felons. It's plain as day. We can get you that. We have it. We have a copy of it. And what concerned me about that, John, was what that means is, quite literally, I'm not saying it would happen, but I'm saying it could happen. Your local pharmacy could hire a convicted drug dealer, and that person would be in the middle of the place to dispense drugs. I don't think that's appropriate in the middle of an opioid overdose crisis. That's where I disagreed with the senator on. I think we have veterans courts here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I think they're a great thing. Now, we don't have as many as we need or should have. We have them in several counties. I've spoken to district's attorneys and others. They believe these are working extremely well. I would be very supportive of extending that. I'm also very supportive of rehabilitation and reentry into society. I'm not against that, but what I am against is, if you're an employer, I think you have a right to know. I do think you have a right to know. If you have someone driving a bus with 60 people in it, or a train, or as I said, running a pharmacy, I just think you have a right to know. I think there's a lot of employers, in fact, I've spoken to a lot of employers who are more than happy to deal with these folks who have had an unfortunate incident in their lives, but they want to know what is it that they have to maybe watch out for after the person's employed. Was this petty theft? What was it? If you're working in a department store, should you at least be aware of that as an employer? I think employers have the right to know.
Can I just?
Yeah.
So
You
I'm
realize
clear.
the senator's bill that would not apply, specifically does not apply to felons. And
No,
those
but-
convicted of felonies.
No, my point, but what I said on stage was he authored an editorial, his name is on it, that said, I would like to extend this to nonviolent felons.
But the legislation as it exists now does not apply to felons.
Yeah, I understand that. I do understand that. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's what I was just wondering. So you would support this bill that just passed the House that would allow the summary offenses as well as first and second degree misdemeanors to be like, you know, you'd have limited access to it after 10 years of clean living.
I have to admit I haven't read it. I haven't read it, but here's what I would say is I am all for efforts to rehabilitate those who have been accused and served their time, paid their debt to society. To help make them productive citizens would be very important to me. We are short tens of thousands of jobs and in certain skills in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I think it would be fabulous if we could get these folks back on their feet. If that's what that bill says it's going to do, I think that's fine. But I just want to acknowledge I haven't. I don't know when was that passed.
Just this past week.
Yeah, I just haven't had a chance to look at it.
But part of that also is the employers would not have access to that. Now you said that you thought employers should know. Should they know about the summary and misdemeanor offenses?
I think they should. I really do. I mean, I've spoken to hundreds of employers, and you know, the opportunity for them to get sued. Think about our litigious society today, right? Just think about that for a second. Employers have been sued for a lot less than that. Plus, let's take an optimistic view. Let's mentor that person as we employ them and try to help them along on whatever it was their shortcoming was.
For 10 years of clean living without any arrest would not have moved them in that direction.
I'll have to get back to you after I read it.
Okay.
I don't want to be like Nancy Pelosi and find out only after it's passed what's in it. I haven't had a chance to read it yet.
I want to get back to opioids real fast.
Yes.
We're going to run out of time very soon.
Yeah.
The current administration has expended funding for treatment beds. There's a prescription drug tracking database. Prescriptions for opioids are down. Generally, sadly, the death rate has not decreased as a consequence. Right. And the governor has declared a disaster declaration that gives the states some broader latitude to deal with this emergency. If elected, one, do you think those are good steps? One. Two, if elected, what specifically different steps would Governor Paul Mango take to fight the epidemic? First
of all, I think we should give the governor credit for trying to intervene on the clinical aspect of this challenge, right? Over prescriptions and the, as you said, John, the integrated pharmacy database. So let's give kudos where kudos are due. But this is a much more comprehensive challenge than the clinical side of it. I'm not for eliminating minimum mandatory sentences for drug dealers, as maybe the governor has expressed in the past. Not while we're in the middle of this. I think there is a criminal element. I think we should have harsher penalties for those who are dealing drugs to our children, leading to these literally 100 deaths a week. I really do. But I've always said this. I think it's principally a social issue. I think there's some social context here, and we talked about it before in the context of schools. People feel isolated. They're not mentored. I mean, when I was growing up, it was my parents, it was my neighbors, it was my Little League coaches, it was my Boy Scout troop leaders. I was getting that type of structure and discipline from a whole bunch of folks, and mentorship, by the way, in a very positive way. We've lost a lot of that in our society, and I think that we have to address that before we'll ever eradicate the drug overdose epidemic. But I've also said, I think this is at least 18 or 20 different epidemics in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It's not one epidemic. How it affects one community is different than how it affects another. And I think if we can organize the relevant parties in each local community, coroners, pharmacists, law enforcement, EMS specialists, doctors, parents who have lost kids, we can get to the bottom of this issue in each community. I think we organize them, we give them the information they need to make good decisions, and then the state should resource them to the extent they need it to eradicate it. But again, I'm very much against these one-size-fits-all mandates that may not be relevant to 19 out of those 20 different epidemics, so to speak. It's a different philosophy.
Back on the fairness issue.
Yes.
I'm thinking that since we're in such a trouble financially, Pennsylvania, that seniors may get taxed. What are the chances? I mean, they say that we are going to give the teachers what they bargained for because we have an agreement with them. Is there any chance in your administration that retirement pensions will be taxed since they're not presently?
No, and this is where I disagree with my opponent. I mean, the senator has said, why aren't we taxing seniors whose income is above a certain level on their pensions? By the way, he's called them the greediest, these are his words, he's called them, seniors, the greediest generation ever. I think they're the greatest generation ever, if they're World War II veterans, by the way. So this is not, we need more taxpayers, we don't need any more taxes. My role as next governor of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, as I've said on multiple occasions, is to bring our jobs and our children back home. We have everything within our grasp to grow this economy at 3 or 4 or 5%. We won't have to worry about any more taxes. We will have a heck of a lot more taxpayers, and that's where we have to take this, not taxing our poor seniors.
Just a couple that I'm hoping to get quick responses to here.
Is this like the, what do they call it? The lightning round, there you go. Yes or no answers? Okay.
You can expand a little bit, but the idea of charging all municipalities that don't have, or that rely on the state police for their part or full-time police protection.
Nope, I'm against it. I'm against it.
Why?
Because we have a governor who's already taking $800 million. I shouldn't say just a governor and a legislature, quite honestly. He's taking $800 million from our highest gas tax in the country, Act 89, 58 cents a gallon, and using it already in the general fund. And I am disappointed that the governor is politicizing our Pennsylvania State Police. Hey, listen, I've spoken to a lot of those guys. They don't care where the money comes from, but they're being put in the middle of this by saying we're taking money from infrastructure to pay for the state police because they're patrolling our highways and that counts as infrastructure. No, we have a no-growth governor who can't generate the revenue necessary to have a budget absent gambling more, smoking more, drinking more, and borrowing from the future. I just think it's disgraceful to put our Pennsylvania State Police in the middle of it. And the per capita tax is doing the same thing. We have to grow the economy. We won't have to worry about any per capita tax on the poor rural citizens.
And just a bill that could come up this week, because I know you said you're against abortion. So should the state prohibit abortions of a child solely based on prenatal determination that the child would be born with Down syndrome?
I believe life begins at conception, Jan. You know that. I am staunchly pro-life. I don't believe, even the Supreme Court in Roe versus Wade says there should not be any abortions beyond the point of viability. Science has taken that point of viability down to 21 weeks and 6 days. That's empirical. Okay? We in Pennsylvania are at 24 weeks. Okay? We as a country are one of 7 countries in the world that have abortions that late. So I am in favor of helping these young women through these decisions, offering them more alternatives for these children. If they don't feel they're capable of taking care of a child with certain disabilities, I think we ought to offer them options. Adoption, foster homes, and so forth. We ought to promote a culture of life, and that's what I would do as governor.
To that point, I have met with moms. You're a father. I'm a father. We know that that 22-week ultrasound is often critical and determinative. With mothers who, at the 22nd week ultrasound, have detected fetal abnormalities that would either make the child subject to a lifelong of awful disability or to a short and painful life immediately upon birth. If you have your way and abortion is limited to the 21st week of pregnancy, abrogating that 22-week ultrasound, what do you say to those women that you've taken that choice away from?
Well, here's what I would say, John. We have a guy on our campaign. His name is Daniel Freeman. He's a Down syndrome child. There is not a more loving child that I've encountered in 15 months on the campaign trail. This guy introduces me at events. He introduces me as the next governor of Pennsylvania. This is the most precious thing I've seen in 15 months. Why don't we let God make that decision on that child's future at that stage? I can tell you these kids are outstanding. They're wonderful. They're loving. I just don't think at that stage it's the mother's decision. I just don't think it's the mother's decision. I think it's God's decision.
Would you ever think of a tax plan that was recently implemented across the United States, with the exception of adding something for veterans?
Just clarify,
The
Vincent, a little.
omnibus bill and the tax reform bill, which put more money in most Americans' pockets. So would you have tax, but you try to get legislation passed to decrease Pennsylvania taxes and also increase money which is going to veterans?
Yeah. So first of all, we've already proposed a decrease in taxes here in Pennsylvania, starting with corporate taxes, some of the highest in the country. If you read our plan, we are proposing to take it down from 10 to 3.07, basically to the rate of the personal income tax. So I'm for as much low tax as we can possibly get. I think we're doing a few things for our veterans in Pennsylvania, and maybe we can extend those, Vincent. One of them is particularly those who come back with severe injuries. We waive, I'm almost positive we waive a lot of their property taxes here in Pennsylvania. So I'm all for making it easier for veterans to not only come back into society, but to deal with a lot of the injuries that they have. And I think if we could extend some of the benefits that the state has already introduced in that regard as it relates to property taxes and other things, I think that's great.
I mean, the personal income tax, having a bill that would lower the personal income tax.
Yeah.
You said corporate.
Yeah.
You didn't say personal.
Well, we're at 3.07, which is very competitive relative to other states right now.
Okay.
I think I don't know, these guys can verify, certainly the top 10. I think there's 6 or 7 states that have 0 personal income tax, but I think we're just behind that. Someone would have to verify it, but that's not where I would start because we actually have quite a competitive personal income tax rate.
So that's why you mentioned real estate tax then.
Yeah, well, real estate tax is a conversion from one type to another, but corporate tax is where we stick out like a sore thumb now.
To that, I want to talk quickly about property tax reform. There's
Yeah.
another push in the Senate Bill 76 that
Yeah.
would eliminate the property tax levy, replace it with a higher PIT and a
Yeah.
higher sales tax. As you probably know, one of the great impediments here to eliminating property tax has always been raising the sufficient revenue to
Yeah.
replace that, something in the tune of $12 to $14 billion.
Yeah.
Do you support, refresh my memory, do you support 76?
Yes, I do.
How do you propose to raise that? Is it possible to raise that kind of revenue to replace
Yeah.
the property tax?
Yeah, so the bill talks about this, and I don't have the exact numbers, John, but it takes our sales tax from 6 to 7,
Yeah.
and it takes the personal income tax from 3 to 4.95 or something like that.
Right.
Now, I know this is a couple years old at this stage, but I spoke to the author of that bill, the chief sponsor, Dave Argel. I read the entire bill myself. I'd have to verify that the numbers are still relevant 3 years hence, because I think it was introduced in 2014 or something like that. But at least at the time, those numbers seem to be roughly accurate. As you know, we generate $32 billion chiefly from 2 sources today. That's income tax and sales tax. So the numbers seem roughly correct at the time. I think they'd have to be updated, but yes, we support Senate Bill 76.
That, strictly speaking, is a tax increase, although some of your fellow travelers like to characterize it as a tax shift.
Yeah.
You are tax increase averse. How does that work for you?
Well, the numbers actually are supposed to work out where it's a direct exchange. On some people it will be a tax increase, on others it'll be a significant tax decrease. I just view it as an alternative way to finance the exact same amount, which is what the intent of the bill is. But I understand your question.
Jan,
So much for the lightning round. Come on.
No,
This is like thunder and lightning.
What about the pension debt? I mean, do you feel
Yeah.
that the changes that they enacted last year are enough that we should just?
Nope.
Okay.
Not even
Let's hear
close.
about it.
In fact, in some ways, it set us backwards a bit. But again, I come back to where I started, and it's not a cop-out, but we're never going to solve the pension issue without a growth economy, bringing our jobs and our children back home. So that is absolutely priority number 1 for me, because a lot of things can flow from that. A lot of things can flow. Funding education, funding seniors' needs, funding veterans' needs, funding our pensions. But we have to do a couple more things. I'm a big proponent of an early buyout, and I've talked about this before. If you're upon retirement, if you're entitled to, let's say, $50,000 a year over 20 years, that's $1 million. I think a lot of folks would take $600,000 if we handed it to them on the spot. And there's evidence of that in other parts of our lives, like the lottery. That would save the state a lot of money, and I think it would make some of our retirees happier, because then maybe they can make some investments with that they can't over 20 years. I think we have to get on to what I call voluntary overtime abuse. My understanding is there's still a lot of it. As you know, the pensions are determined by the last 3 years of your compensation. I know there's forced overtime. A lot of our law enforcement officers, firefighters, and so forth, fine, but voluntary overtime we have to address. And I believe in a very humane way over 4 or 5 years, Jan, that we don't need 73,000 state employees. I'm not talking about layoffs. I'm talking about attrition. I'm talking about retirements. Modernize, digitize, automate functions in the government that corporate America has had for 20 years. Again, not laying off anyone. We lose, what, about 6,000 a year of our state employees from retirement and attrition. I know it's not a one-for-one because the skill sets are different, but I think we can get down to a much more reasonable sized government in a humane way, and that's another way to control our future pension expenses. So growth, early buyouts, continue to move toward defined contribution, eliminate abuse of voluntary overtime, and let's right-size the government in a humane way.
How does the overtime abuse go over with the State Troopers Association when you tell them about that?
Voluntary overtime. Voluntary.
But we know though that as when some police officers or troopers, as they get up towards 20, 25 years and they're hitting retirement age,
yeah,
they will begin racking up OT to make their pensions.
We'd have
if
to
you say
show
to them you want to get rid of voluntary overtime, I can't imagine they'd be thrilled.
Well, voluntary overtime abuses. Voluntary overtime abuses. I'm not saying they'd be thrilled, but you know, I've spoken to a lot of those leaders, and they want to make sure there's a lot of forced overtime for, you know what, how many we're short right now?
I know.
Several hundred. And I think a lot of these folks, quite honestly, when you talk about the time they're spending away from their families and everything else, they prefer less overtime. I don't think they are abusing the system, and I think the leaders want to make sure they're not abusing the system.
We talk a lot about pension reform at the state level. As I'm sure you'd
Yeah.
agree, the next great bubble coming is municipal pensions.
Yeah.
The state is somewhat more limited in how it can address that, but how would
Yeah.
Governor Mango address municipal pension bubble?
Well, I wouldn't. What I wouldn't do is bail out folks in one city by using the tax dollars of someone in another city. There have been a lot of, I've spoken to a lot of county commissioners. As you know, I have endorsements from 20 of them. They are very proud of the fact that their pensions are 85, 90, 95, 100% funded. They've been very fine stewards of the taxpayers' dollars and their obligation to fund those pensions. Why would we penalize them because others have been less good stewards, less responsible? That's not the case. I think this is a case where elections have consequences, and I think voters ought to know. They ought to have transparency into how well funded those pensions are. If I'm a government worker at a municipal or county level, I'd want to know that as well, and I'd want to spread that word because that's my future. I believe when we make an obligation, I'm not saying all the obligations we've made are appropriate. I think politicians have made promises that are, well beyond what we can ever afford. But if we made that obligation, we have to fulfill it. We have to fulfill it. And there are restructuring opportunities for government organizations that they'd have to go through to properly deal with that. We're not going to take money from taxpayers in one part of the state and the Commonwealth to fund the irresponsibility of leaders in another, simply said.
Okay, so another question. How close is your platform with Trump's agenda?
There is a unbelievable amount of overlap between the president and my agenda. Jobs in the economy, very high priority. Infrastructure, you've heard me talk about that before. We can't have a third world infrastructure and be a globally competitive first world economy. Vocational training, rebuilding our skilled labor force. Healthcare reform, which is a big issue for me, and we've already stated what our position would be. So, he has to deal with a lot of international issues that I won't have to deal with, but as it relates to domestic policy, there's an enormous amount of overlap in our priorities. And by the way, I think he's doing a heck of a good job in the face of significant resistance on a lot of those priorities. Opioid overdose, another one he just came out with as a priority the other day, right, or a couple weeks ago. Big priority for us.
Jan, last word to you.
Last lightning round question, Jan.
Oh, let's see here. Well, yeah, the one thing that you talked about is, and I think when state employees are hearing you talk about, shrinking state government, and from what I recall from reading your paper was that you're going to shift a lot more services down on the counties.
Yes.
Will dollars follow to fund those services at the county level?
Over time, they have to. They have to. And what I mean is, as we, through attrition, through retirement, we start to work, there's a lot of redundancy, what I call vertically, in the Commonwealth. Everyone's talking about combining departments in Harrisburg. The redundancy from snow removal to permitting to health and human services vertically. When I say vertically, township, municipality, county, state, that's where we think, and it's not only the cost of that, it's the bureaucracy associated with that, and the number of gates that a business leader has to go through to get a permit, and oh my goodness, right? So I think this is about being nimble and adaptive as well as cost, but yes, I'm a big believer that our most pressing social issues in particular need to be resolved much more at a local level because they are very differently expressed at each level across the Commonwealth. Again, I'm against one-size-fits-all mandates. I think the people of Pennsylvania are informed enough, knowledgeable enough, in touch enough at the local community that they, when properly organized, they can solve this. The days of the PhD in Harrisburg solving all our problems are over. We've tried that.
What about with school districts? Should counties, to eliminate the redundancy,
Yeah.
should counties consolidate their school districts?
I absolutely think there are opportunities for what I call shared services within our school districts. You could think of a lot of back office administrative services, nutritional services, maintenance services, even bus lines and those types of things. I think that would be fabulous. What I don't want to happen, though, is I know in our school district in Allegheny County, the success of our public school district is a function of local ownership, and that has to do with the curriculum, right? It has to do with programs. It has to do with how we treat safety. And I think that should remain very local. So I'm more in favor of a hybrid where you have local ownership by parents and local boards, but you take the, if you will, kind of the administrative aspects of our schools and the logistical aspects of our schools and the mechanical aspects of our schools, and we can get them to a level of scale by combining them with many different school districts. That's where I'd love to see it go, but we can't force people to do that. I think we have to encourage them. We can encourage them economically. I think we can encourage them, and I'm a big believer in this, Jan, with pilots. So in my business career, nothing has ever succeeded like success. So you can talk all day about how good something could be, but when you show someone what good looks like, it's almost impossible to stop it. So let's take a few school districts. Let's see what happens, and then let the rest of the Commonwealth take a look, and let's follow the facts on that. And if it's positive, I guarantee you parents and boards and everyone else are going to look at that and say, why aren't we doing that? That's the way I would create the change in Pennsylvania.
Paul Mango, thanks for coming in.
Hey, thanks, John. Thanks, Anwar. Thanks, Vincent. Thanks, Jan. Great to be with you today.